You know what's really amazing is how little things in history, I should say the perversion of history, can affect the myth making in our world in such a large way. And if you've seen the movie Tombstone, starring Kurt Russell as Wyatt Earp and Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday, or Wyatt Earp, the Kevin Costner movie, they were both made the same year, 1993. And they have a couple of things in common that I really want to get into and talk about here on the actual history. So, if you've seen the movies, you know that Sadie Marcus, who became Mrs. Wyatt Earp, came to Tombstone as an actress in the Pauline Markham Theater group. And then she met Wyatt Earp, and they eventually became common law man and wife. Well, the problem with that is that, and none of that's true. Uh, that's for starters, okay? But the real thing that we want to get to is in both movies, they dealt with the fact that Josephine, Sadie Marcus, posed for a semi nude photo, look right there. Um, and one of them, right as the gunfight is about to happen. So the semi-nude photo, which ended up on the book by Glenn Boyer, it's that same photo, um, is what launched all of this. And we want to talk about the genesis of that photo and the true story of Sadie Marcus, which you got to hold on to your seat here. This is a very sordid tale, and you can see why she did not want the real story told. But over the years, since that book came out, which was in 1976, um, a lot of researchers have gone at this, and I believe we're as close to the truth as we'll probably ever get. Of course, I say that, but then if you've done this business as long as I have, you know that eventually everything turns, and things we knew 25 years ago are not true. And the whole ball of wax keeps moving. But let's dig into this one just for grins here today, and talk about the genesis of the what is known as the Kaloma photo. Now, Glenn Boyer is the very controversial author and researcher who was kind of the king of the Earpology in the 1970s. And in fact, his book, I Married Wyatt Earp, was a bestseller, and the University of Arizona Press published it. And it ended up, not like I said, in those two movies, but also in 1983, there was a made for television movie that appeared on NBC called I Married Wyatt Earp, with Marie Osmond as Sadie Josephine Marcus. And Bruce Boxleitner is probably the best Wyatt Earp. It looks more like Wyatt Earp than virtually anyone else who's played him, especially Hugh O'Brien. But anyway, that's another story. So let's go back a little bit and talk about that photo. So the photo is this kind of like semi-sex, she's semi-nude, And when the book hit, it was like, oh my goodness, this is just perfect. This is really Mrs. Wyatt Earp, and she posed for this salacious photo. How did that happen? Well, 2 years after the book came out, and it was the sensation, I happened to be in Austin, Texas, in a recording studio, and I noticed on the wall in the control room, there was this San Francisco hippie gonzo poster for the Fillmore featuring Vanilla Fudge. And in the poster was this same photo, the photo of that purported to be a Mrs. Wyatt Earp. And I remember at the time thinking, well, how does Mrs. Wyatt Earp end up on a Vanilla Fudge concert poster? That just doesn't make any sense. Well, then researchers started to dig around, and it was discovered that the poster had a copyright mark on it for the Pastime Novelty Company out of New York. So that was the first red flag that perhaps this wasn't what it seemed to be. And so researchers also started to delve into the veracity of the Kaysen manuscript. And I'm going to explain what that is to you now, because the book that Glenn Boyer wrote, which was predicated and used in the two movies that we just mentioned, all came out of the so-called case and manuscript. And here's what happened. Wyatt Earp, in his last years in the 1920s, he was desperate to sell his life story, and he could not. He had a mining engineer friend, John Flood, write their story, and they'd work on it every Sunday over the kitchen table in Los Angeles in their rented apartment. And Josephine would say it has to be a clean story. It has to have pep. And so I always thought that if I could get to the Wyatt Earp manuscript, I would see the truth about Tombstone and his life, and only to discover it in the 1980s out in Scottsdale at Antigone bookstore. And I finally found it, and I read it, and it was just awful. It was just awful. And it, for example, in the OK Corral fight, there was 247 cracks. That somebody had told the Earps that in those days you had to put the word crack, capital CRACK, exclamation point, for a gunshot. And so Wyatt is describing what's going on, and he's aiming at Billy Clanton, crack, crack, crack. And then he moved to the other side, crack, crack. And like I said, I counted 247 cracks. And he even makes the ridiculous claim that the gun barrels were so hot they had to put them in a water trough. I know this is just insanely stupid. I know, but it gets better. Okay, so he couldn't sell his story. And as a matter of fact, in the last months of his life, a young intern at the White House, Stuart Lake, came out and found him, and he finally agreed to have him do the article. And then Earp died, and his last words are suppose. And another thing happened, okay, and that was when the Wyatt Earp Frontier Marshal came out in 1931. Hollywood was under attack because they were doing gangster movies, and the Hays Code came in and said, you got to stop doing that. Okay. The youth of America is, can't see these gangster movies where crime pays. And he tried to shut them down. Okay. So, the Earp story all of a sudden made sense in the 30s because you could put a Western in a gangster movie, and it's the Tombstone story. Gamblers, Law versus Order. In fact, Law and Order became a title, one of the first Earp movies. So now all of a sudden, this engine starts going, and Mrs. Earp, Josephine Sadie Marcus, she was able to keep her sordid past out of that story. As a matter of fact, she got it so that Wyatt Earp was married to Maddie, his second wife, who was also a prostitute in Tombstone, and she got that squashed and left out of the story. So by 1937, long after her husband had died, she was in a bad way. She had a sister who had some money, Henrietta, and she had passed, and Henrietta's kids would not give her any money. It sound familiar? And so anyway, so she went to the cousins of the Earp, and that was Mabel Casson Earp. I'm sorry, Mabel Earp Casson and Vinola Earp Ackerman. And they were cousins, and she talked them into letting her live with them, and they were going to tell her story so that she could cash in and make some money. Well, make a long story short, it 4 years, and they never could get her to fill in the gap. She was very evasive, and for strong reasons. And so then what happened was Glenn Boyer came onto the scene, and he found the case and manuscript. And he claimed that a woman that he met in Yuma in 1956, Carmelita, she owned a Mexican restaurant there, Carmelita's Place. And he claimed that she gave him the picture of Sadie, the semi-nude picture, and that connected it to the family. Well, there was only one problem there. As researchers started to go into that story, they found out that Carmelita was 8 years old when Earp was out at the Harquahala mines, and so that didn't make any sense. And so then Boyer changed his story, and he said, I think this was found in Johnny Behan's his remains. He had things from his life and stuff. It was in the courthouse, and he claimed that it came out of there, and the picture was because Behan was involved as Mrs. Johnny Behan for a time in Tombstone, if you know that story. So now this thing is becoming more and more sordid, and there are attacks on the University of Arizona Press in the paper that I worked for, the New Times Weekly, and uh, we had done several investigative stories on how the story had too many holes, to make sense. So now fast forward to 2001, and we had bought True West magazine and moved it to Cape Creek, Arizona. And we had an article in 2001 by Carol Mitchell. She's passed, but great article called Lady Sadie, and she hit the big question mark right between the eyes. And that's this, is that there was a prostitute in Prescott who was involved with Johnny Bean, and her name was Sadie Mansfield, 14 years old. And she questioned whether this was, in fact, uh, somebody who became Mrs. Wyatt Earp later, and but there was question marks. Then you enter into the scene about 10 years later. Roger J, an excellent, he's passed as well. He dug deeper and connected all the dots. And then our own Sherry Monahan, who does a column for us at a very popular column on food for True West magazine. She published her book, which I got to get the name right here. The name of her book is Mrs. Earp, The Wives and Lovers of the Earp Brothers. And that came out 2018. And now there's the final book, or I should say the latest book, by Peter Brand of Australia. And it is the true story, Josephine Sadie Marcus, The Sordid Truth, 1870 to 1883. And it spells out the facts now that she claimed, Sadie Marcus claimed, that she was from a wealthy merchant family in San Francisco, and that she ran away with the theatrical group that came to Tombstone. And in fact, a point of fact, she was arrested for prostitution at the age of 12 and brought home. Two girls ran away with a known prostitute and brought home, and then she ran away again. And in her telling of the story of how she came to Arizona, she makes a little mistake, and she says she names a person who was actually with them that went to Prescott as a prostitute group. So we know that the Earps, all the Earps brothers, were involved with prostitutes in their younger days, and so it doesn't make it makes a lot of sense that this story was um, pretty sordid and awful. Anyway, you need to see that book. We just did an entire issue on the Earp brothers and all the new scholarship from Mark Lee Gardner, Brothers of the Gun, and this book by Peter Brand, which we highly recommend that you get it. And if you love the story, now the actual photo, it turns out that was been used by Vanilla Fudge and many others, and it's not really her. But check out this scene from the actual movie of taking the picture. And that, my friend, it pays off the old saying that nothing changes more than the past, or my personal favorite, which is history is a cruel trick played on the dead by the living.